Have you ever wondered why some of your comic books have a barcode on the cover and some have a little box with a Spider-Man head on it? Have you ever heard terms like direct sales or direct market or newsstand and wondered what that meant in regard to comic books? If so, you're in the right place. Today we're exploring the history of comic books and focusing on the dawn of the direct sales market. Hi, I'm Jesse. Thanks for pressing play. Today we're taking a trip through history from just before the start of the direct sales market to today. But to do that, we must first answer the question, what is a newsstand? Well, a newsstand is a retail location like a newsstand, grocery stores, drugstores, supermarkets, and other magazine venues, all of whom got standard amounts of random books from their suppliers to sell. They had these regional independent distributor wholesalers who would take books from the publishers to the newsstands and street corners on these giant pallets of bundled magazines. They call them bricks. Newsstands, the retailers would typically receive 30% discounts from their wholesalers, and unsold copies could be returned, and those returns and shipping back could kind of get expensive. So later, just a piece of the cover torn off could be shipped back. And even later after that, just a written affidavit was all that was required to get their refund back. And that is what the comic book and newsstand market was. The problem with this is some of the retailers, in some cases, were faking their affidavits and not actually destroying copies that they claimed were unsold. Coverless and torn books ended up in flea markets and, warehouse sales down the line. And some would say these were tied to illegal racketeering and mafia-influenced scams. And some of the books were even turned into paper pulp later on for just a little bit of money back on top of what they got from their refund. Prices went from 12 cents in 1961 to 15 cents by 1969 and even up to 25 cents in 73, and this was due to rising paper and printing costs. And at the same time, sell-through rates were dropping. Some estimates had Marvel during this time at 35%, which meant for every 10 copies that were on shelves, only 3 or 4 would sell, and then the rest would have to be returned. There was no New Comic Wednesday, so books got to newsstands when they just happened to be on the distributor's route schedule. In 1972, school teacher and convention organizer Phil Suling started Seagate Distributors. Suling cut deals with publishers to distribute directly to shops, bypassing what was probably about 500 of the wholesalers spread across America. He offered up to 60% discounts, but without the returnability that the newsstands offered. While being able to return, books is nice in terms of maintaining your profit margins somewhat, it's a hassle to figure out what you need to return, record it, ship it back, and arguably, the biggest benefit to Suling's new program was that Seagate shipped directly from the publisher's contracted printing empire, which was World Color Press in Illinois, to the shops, bypassing the middleman. The wholesalers a lot of times were late on their shipments because they also covered all of the magazines for their whole region, and because comics were a low priority, sometimes if they didn't have room, they'd sit on the truck or not even make it out of the warehouse until the following week. So Suling's system got comics on shelves a week, in some cases, before a newsstand. So while many might tell you that 1978 or 79 was the start of the direct market, it was this, Suling's enterprise, that was the birth of the direct sales market. And the direct market rise from this point on was helped by the fact that newsstand distributors and magazine sales itself were shrinking, and the comic books were just a small part of that business, thus a much lower priority. Distributors focused on saving bigger money portions of their business. Newsstand distributors got 60% discount from publishers and passed on 30% discount to resellers. Suling, who also got 60% discount, was able to offer shops 40%, so 10% more than the newsstand wholesalers, but 40 to 50% off of what was 25 cents or 40 cents in 1980. It's still not a huge amount of money, but no returnability meant unsold copies became back issues. Comics in the 1970s were struggling, especially at DC, and actually see my How Marvel Saved DC video for more on the DC explosion in this time period. 600 million copies were in circulation in 1960. It went all the way down to 250 million by the late 70s. In June, big date, June 26, 1974, the UPC, the Universal Product Code, was officially introduced and became a way for stores to track inventory much more accurately. 1976, comic publishers began adding UPCs to the covers. 1977, 1978 was when Phil Suling started setting up these regional sub-distributors that he would filter his comics through. And shops that were also sub-distributors got even greater discounts. This is when he started attracting competitors like Urjack, Steve Jeppy, Bud Plant, a few others. In 1979, after a nasty antitrust lawsuit and a rather forceful letter from Chuck Rosansky ended up on the desk of Jim Galton and Ed Shukin at Marvel, Marvel opened up the policy of direct distribution and began selling via a Seagate model to anyone that could meet minimum order requirements. And this is what people will tell you as the start of the direct market, but it goes back to 72 as we just talked about. DC was slower at getting into the direct market, and DC decided it would anoint distributors who could buy from them and who could buy from not, and that's a quote. It also made it easier for independent publishers to get into the market, and the independent marketplace grew exponentially during this time. The DC would be able to determine who would be a distributor and who wouldn't. They kind of, by way of that, chose the fate of a lot of distributors during this time. A lot of those wholesalers. At the start of the direct market, there was nothing to distinguish between the books, nothing to indicate what was non-returnable and what was. So first they had a strike-through that was introduced after the UPC codes found their way onto the comic books, which was just a printed line through the barcode. These indicated that they went to the direct market. The need for this was born from some unscrupulous activities by some retailers. They would buy the books at a great discount through Seagate or through their direct sales pipeline, and then return them via their newsstand distributor and get a refund of the books at the newsstand market rate. They could also buy back comics from their customers at pennies on the dollar and return them for a refund. So the strike-through worked, but it was ugly. So Marvel introduced a new image for the barcode box. That's where we get the famous Spidey head. In my next video in the series, we're going to talk more about that infamous barcode box as well as the nostalgic corner box. So stay tuned for that. The first direct sales exclusive book was in 1981. It was Dazzler #1, and it's estimated at about 400,000 copies for that. Books had been sold as direct market previously, but this book was the first to only go through the direct market line and only to comic shops. By 1993, shops started getting barcode scanners, and all the books eventually had the UPC code. So some said direct sales and some said newsstand. In 1980, the early companies like Seagate and Urjax fell out of power during what's called the air freight wars, and companies like Diamond and Capital City and Heroes World grew to prominence, and I talked about them in my 1990s video, so you can look for that in this playlist. Ever since the collapse of Capital City in the 90s, Diamond has, despite what the Department of Justice investigation in the late 90s said, they've had a monopoly on comic book distribution, although not on books or magazine distribution, which is the loophole that they were able to win the investigation through. So 1970, there was about 100 shops in the United States. It went up really 70 in 2 years. There was only about 30 in 1968. 1979 was about 700 or 800 shops, and 94% of the market was the newsstand market. 1980, 80% of the market newsstand. In 1985, it was 50-50. There were 3,000 shops in the United States and 50% of the market was newsstand. 1993, which was the height of the boom and the huge explosion in comic book shops opening up. And you can find out why, again, in my 1990s video. 10,000 comic book shops were in the United States, and the amount of newsstand dropped drastically during this time period. By 1995, only 10% of the market was newsstand. There were 6,000 shops in the country, so the amount of comic book shops dropped, and from 85 to 95, 10 years, it went from 50 to 10%. But Image Comics, interestingly enough, was 99% direct market. In 2000, only 5% of the market was newsstand. And from 2013 to 2018, 1% of the market is newsstand. Currently, there's about 3,500 shops in America. Marvel ended newsstand distribution in 2010, and they had what's called a single issue program through Books A Million and Barnes & Noble. That ended at the end of 2012. DC Comics ended their newsstand program in 2017, and as of 2018, only Archie Comics, Bongo Comics, and Alterna Comics are keeping that newsstand flame lit. And that is the history of the comic book newsstand and direct sales from their inception up to this day. And thanks for watching and listening. Stay tuned for the UPC and corner box video, and please leave me a comment or question down below. I'd love to hear your questions or additional information you want to add to this, feedback as well. But this is Jesse here with JLS Comics, and I will see you in the next video.